Welcome everyone to our next edition of LinkedIn Live, our live broadcast. And those of you that are my regular followers, you know that I'm passionate about digital transformation. And we continue to bring subjects of digital transformation that help you with strategies and tactics to be successful in your journey of digital transformation. Today, we look at methodology matters. In this episode of what we've called a three-part series, Value Undiscovered, we're going to look at the why and the how of using digital transformation and advanced analytics to solve large capital investment challenges. And today, again, like I usually do, I have a couple of special guests with us today. One of them who's a chief marketing officer and also technical. And we also have a technical individual with us. We're going to be talking about the hows and the whys of implementing digital transformation and advanced analytics in your environment. You are not going to want to miss this. Good morning and welcome. I'm glad to have you guys with us today.
Morning.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, I have two guests with me today. I have Bodwin and I have Matthew. Bodwin, where are you coming to us from today? Where are you located?
I'm in Vancouver, Canada.
Excellent. How are things there this spring? Do we have some snow there, or how's life in Vancouver?
Foggy.
Springtime in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, I understand. Very good. Hey, listen, as we get started here, I just wanted to do a quick introduction of our two guests, and then we'll go over some details of the broadcast coming up. We'll get into details. But Bodwin, can you just quickly, for our viewers, can you tell us who you are and what do you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Bodwin Nayans. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Copperleaf in Vancouver. And by training, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I spent most of my life actually doing industrial automation.
Oh, fantastic. We're looking forward to seeing how your technical background comes together with digital and with your marketing expertise. Thanks. And then we also have Matthew Hare. Matt, how are you this morning today?
Hi, Mark. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back again.
Great, good to have you here again. Can you tell our viewers again, if they didn't see last week's broadcast, just who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Matthew Hare. I'm a market development manager here at Copperleaf, and I've spent some of the last few years working with some of the world's biggest organizations to improve their capital planning processes and help them define their own value-based decision-making framework.
Great, fantastic. Hey, listen, I'm looking forward to having a good discussion here today. Is that I'm passionate about digital transformation, and it's always exciting for me to see what's happening in other parts of the industry, and for me to share those things with those of you that are watching by bringing people into these broadcasts. And one way you can help us to be successful is to share the broadcast. In case you don't know it, LinkedIn has made a small change, and the way to share your broadcast, actually, if you're watching from this screen, is down below. It says share, and you can actually share the broadcast out, and it'll help us to get the word out to other people that we want to get this valuable information about digital transformation. And then also, we want to have you comment. This is actually a live broadcast. We do these live because we want to draw you into the conversation, and we'd like to ask for you to be able to maybe share some of your expertise or ask a question. And it just makes it more fun and dynamic. And if you look at down in the bottom right-hand corner there, just like in any other social media application, there's a comment box, and you can type your questions directly in there. We see them live. They come up on the screen, and we'll actually do our best to answer your questions. And one of the things I like to do to kind of kick things off is that we always like to know who's watching the broadcast and where you're watching from. I have a lot of regular followers all around the world, and it's kind of exciting to see where people are watching from. So if you're watching, why don't you just put in the comment box where you're watching from, or just give us a hi, and we'll give you an acknowledgement on the screen as we're going forward here. So go ahead and make some comments and ask some questions as we go, and we look forward to engaging with you. Gentlemen, let's dive right in to this conversation here today. So first of all, Matt, let me jump over to you. Is Copperleaf, you said both you and Bodwin work for Copperleaf. Can you tell us just quickly who Copperleaf is?
Yeah, for sure. So Copperleaf is a software company based in Vancouver. Our main focus and then the problem our software helps solve is helping companies decide where to spend their money or resources when they can't complete every project they want to.
Okay, good. So it's a tool to be able to help, a decision-making tool. Sounds good. Excellent. Bodwin, I've seen some of your company documentation that the word value keeps being used over and over again. Can you tell me why that word value keeps being used at Copperleaf? What does it really mean?
Well, we could spend an hour on that. So basically, the base premise is that as a business, you're investing your resources, be it money or otherwise, to create value, right? Like whatever value means, like that's up to you as an organization to decide what value means in your context. It might be pure financial value, or it might be a much broader definition. It might include societal components, environmental components, you name it. So really the idea is like somehow you have to define that value, and then you have to use that definition in a very rigorous and practical way in your decision making.
Okay, interesting, because I think a lot of times when we look at we have to create a business case, and we're going to look at the outcome of that business case, and we simply jump to the word return on investment. All right. Mm-hmm. And many times we look right away at what it means, a financial return on investment. But I think what you're telling me is the word value is being much more broadly in the terms of getting the maximum opportunity, reducing risk, dollars, just so many different things, meeting goals and objectives of the company. I hear you saying it means a lot of different things. Yeah,
correct.
Excellent.
Correct. And think of it this way, like actually we got started 10 years ago, 15 years ago now in the utility space, and for a good reason. Utilities typically are monopolies, and therefore have somebody looking over their shoulder and actually telling them what value is in their context. Often they're actually not even for profit. Utilities are often co-ops or government owned. So profit is not the motive. It's really serving, the population, if you wish, or serving society. So value there has a very different meaning, or potentially very different meaning. So that's really what got us started on this whole journey.
Really a good point. A good point is that, reducing cost isn't always the first objective of a company like that. Yeah. Hey, listen, I see we have a lot of people that are joining us. Let's just throw a few names up there. I like to always recognize people and thank them for watching the live broadcast. We have somebody that joined us from Toronto. That's excellent. Thanks for joining. Doesn't say who it is. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Here we have someone joining us from Oklahoma. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Ask questions if you'd like. We also have guests from Indiana, from Indianapolis. Actually, I'm a Purdue grad from about 30 years ago. Welcome, Indiana. And we have Dallas, Texas joining us. Curtis, thanks for joining us from Dallas. And we have Daniel there. We just threw his name up there again. And I'm glad to have you here with us today, Daniel. Hey, if anybody else is out there watching from other parts of the world, it's always fun to see where people are joining us from. I usually have people joining us from the UK and from South America. I have a lot of followers in Brazil and in the Middle East. If anybody's out there, just let us know you're watching, and we're happy to acknowledge you as part of this process. Hey, guys, let's continue to go. You brought up a little bit of a thought about other industries. You brought in the electrical and power generation industry, Bodwin. One of the things I'd like to maybe do is I'd like to talk a little bit about current events, maybe in the chemicals space or other spaces. But, what are some of the factors that are driving things within industries today, causing people to need to make decisions, capital kind of decisions? Bodwin, what are some of the factors that are affecting companies today?
Well, I mean, the obvious one, which is staring us, down at us every morning, of course, right now is the pandemic, which has, royally screwed up many businesses and certainly has made decision-making much more complicated. And actually, it has reinforced a trend which was already on its way, which is speed. Like you have to be much quicker in making your decisions and be able to basically adjust to whatever the situation is. Now, second factor, which in particular in capital planning is key, is of course now inflation, which is starting to grow, which presumably will mean, increasing interest rates and therefore, restrictions in access to capital, or at least capital will be more expensive. So you're going to have to be careful. Third factor, which we see and has grown immensely again in the last two years, is the whole ESG movement. So in other words, environmental, social, and governance, both reporting, which is kind of the lagging exercise, but it's starting to really affect the way companies make decisions because they actually want to show they're doing the right thing. So ESG is becoming big. And then, of course, digitalization. So the fact that more and more decision-making is being influenced by the fact that you have digital processes and data available to help that process.
Yeah, we have so many external factors, and some of them tend to sometimes be factors which, I would say negatively affect what we're doing. Of course, we have to dynamically change and make changes, due to things like, economic, factors that are caused by things like pandemics, or we have, we have positive factors like maybe, digital, which have entered into this situation, which have caused us to have, maybe greater abilities to do things. But Matt, let me throw this over to you. Is that of some of the things that he just mentioned, digital and economic downturns and ESG and things like that, is that how do companies have to maybe adopt or adjust, according to what's happening around them?
Yeah, I think the first way they're going to have to adjust is by reevaluating kind of what Bottom was speaking, their own definitions of value, right? Like, how do you expand the scope of that definition past financial returns to look at risk mitigation or ESG impacts, as environmental, social governance, and really find a way to work that into the decision-making process that's repeatable, but also making sure that they're allocating their money to the areas of the business that are really driving the most value.
Excellent. Well, listen, I want to dig into a little bit of some of your background for the two of you in just a second here. But before I do that, I see we have some additional people who are joining us from around the world. Thanks for joining us. We have some people from London. Thanks for joining from the UK. I hope things are going there in the UK. Actually, I'm not sure where that one's coming from, but let's go to the next one, the one from London. And then we have somebody joining us from Hamburg, Germany. It's been a few years since I've been to Hamburg. Welcome, Finn. Glad to have you with us. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us today. It's just really nice to know there's so many people all around the world that are interested in these subjects and these conversations. But Baldwin, I want to come back to you for a second. I think it's interesting a little bit about your background. You said you actually have a technical background, and I'd like to maybe understand a little bit about, what caused you to have interest in this subject matter, that we have today. Tell us a little bit about your journey of how you got where you are right now.
Well, so as I told you, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I'm a true mechanical engineer in the sense that I love tinkering. So it didn't take me long to start tinkering with cars, of course, like many of us do. And in doing so, you come to the conclusion, as an engineer, that actually cars are pretty simple, and, the basic function that they're supposed to perform, you don't need much for it, right? Like, a Toyota Corolla will do it, and reliably too. So why on earth? My question was, like, why on earth are people buying, super fancy cars where it's presumably not a very rational decision, just from an economic and engineering point of view? And that really bugged me for a long time, to the point actually that at some point I quit my job because I just couldn't stand my managers who were driving fancy cars, were making very bad decisions in business too. So I figured that, like, well, clearly the car is an indicator of their ability to, make business decisions. I quit. I literally quit and went to do an MBA because I wanted to learn more about, the non-technical aspects of business. And that was actually very enlightening. It didn't help me much, though, in kind of changing things until I actually ran into the founder of Copperleaf many, many years later. And there I really kind of saw in her vision the fact that, yes, you could actually develop both a methodology and software tools to actually help organizations become much more rational and effective in making their big capital decisions. And that's where we are.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, many times we're looking at the decision-making process, and we want for decisions to be based on logic, but just like what you said in buying a car, is many times the decisions, and car salesmen know this, is that the decisions are based on emotions and how somebody feels. I mean, I drive a BMW SUV, and I have to admit, is that one of the reasons that I have that car is because it just feels good when you drive it. And I'm not certain that I couldn't have something less expensive or different, but you just do it because of the mental attachment to it. That's really interesting. Now, Matt, how do you think that translates over to the way that people make decisions when they're trying to consider different factors? I mean, do we do that all logically, or do emotions come into play as part of that? Or
no, yeah, certainly not. I think emotions can play a big part, right? Project owners, they spend a lot of time developing, the business case for their projects, and in a way, they become emotionally attached to those projects. You get a sense of pride when your project gets funded, so you push for it hard. Where when you kind of introduce some logic and take away that subjectivity and a personal opinion about what's important, and look at it from an organizational perspective, it means that you can kind of remove that emotion and start making better decisions.
Yeah. Okay. That I'm not sure how we remove that emotion. That's the problem, I think. Bodwin, I understand by going to the company website that I saw a picture of you, and you were riding in a big, interesting red boat. And what is this that's happening? And the question I have is that how does risk come into play and decision making as part of this?
All right. Okay, so this is a bit of a departure. I'm Dutch, right? So as you know, Dutchmen, there's two things they learn as kids. That is, how to ride a bike and how to sail. Otherwise, you're not a proper Dutchman. So I learned how to sail, and I actually really liked it. So that's where the emotions kicked in, I guess. And so I've sailed my whole life. And then when I arrived in Canada, one of my friends told me, well, you've been sailing all around the world. Why don't you join the search and rescue operations, to kind of give back in a way to the sailing community? So I did. So I became, that was many, many years ago, I kind of joined, and in the meantime, I grew through the ranks of the Coast Guard, and now I'm basically what they call a coxswain, which is really the captain of the rescue boat in my local community. Now, how does that tie into risk? So, well, as you can imagine, search and rescue on the water is per definition, very risky endeavor. Like, per definition, you're putting yourself into trouble to try to get others out of trouble. So definition of risk is like, what is an acceptable risk, or what's a tolerable risk for a search and rescue operation is, of course, maybe slightly different from what you would do in an industrial environment, but it does force you to think it through. And it does force you to think, like, at which point do we stop spending money, or do we stop putting people, in the line of these risks in order to save other people's lives? So in other words, what's the value of a human life, right, in this particular context? So that's really an interesting process that helped me think this through and kind of tie it back into Copperleaf. Of course, is like, you really need to build a framework, a relatively rational framework, as to how much risk are we willing to take on.
Yeah, the reason I thought that was so interesting, Bodwin, is that I thought, how do you take something that has such a high emotion situation and there's risk involved, and turn it into a process which you're accomplishing your goals and objectives, and your outcomes, from that. And so that made me start thinking a bit about, our topic of discussion today, which was really to drill down into methodology a little bit. And as we look at digital transformation and methodologies, I wanted to start with looking at sort of the why, of all of this. Okay, is that how do you begin down this journey of having some kind of an evaluation framework to be able to determine the why in a situation? Bodwin, where do you even start when you want to be looking at the factors that play into a framework?
Well, we already mentioned the magic word, which was value. So clearly, you need to first agree within your organization as to what value is. Now, that sounds trivial, but it's actually not. It's sometimes literally a half year's worth of work to actually align everybody in the organization to all agree on what we're trying to achieve. Because the larger the company, the more risk there is that there will be silos. There might be historic trends, the way we've always done things, etc. So kind of aligning everybody to a single definition of what we're trying to achieve here is actually key. It's literally building consensus within the company. Then, of course, it's a matter of codifying that into something that can be repeated, as in, I'm going to use this particular definition that we've just come up with every time now. And as Matt says, every project manager is a bit emotional. So what we're going to ask him is like, well, put your emotions aside and tell us exactly in which way that project of yours is contributing to the goals of the organization in a very, kind of measurable way. And on from there, right? So step number one really is like, trying to come up with this kind of agreement within the organization, turn it into something that can be written down literally, and then that can be measured, of course, and then start using that. And then, of course, we can kind of go into layers of refinement. So, for instance, emotions is one part of the equation. The other is competition. Assuming that you don't have enough money and enough resources to everything, project manager are also going to hang on to their projects because they're competing. So they want theirs to come up tops. So they'll maybe kind of overstate the benefits a little bit, just to kind of get higher up on the list. So again, you're trying to avoid that too. You're trying to avoid the gaming within your organization. Even it's for all the right intentions, but people are gaming the system. So you want to avoid that by having, again, a very rigorous way of evaluating projects and then putting them in competition in a mathematical way, as opposed to in a shouting match way.
Interesting. So we're taking that the factors that we're trying to make evaluations or decisions on, and we're trying to put them into a framework and eliminate some of the emotions and make them more based on the facts or on the outcomes or the possible value. That's really interesting. Hey, listen, we have a question that came up that I wanted to throw up there. It's from Bizinik Wahal, and I want to see if maybe we couldn't answer that question. If we could throw that up on the screen there. He's asking how to engage people to accelerate transformation and influence the culture. How do you accelerate transformation? How do you talked about organizational alignment. How do we get organizational alignment, turn that into something and accelerate, guys? What are your thoughts on that?
You're asking me, or you're asking Matt?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just checking. I think, as with many of these exercises, it comes from the top. It really has to be driven by leadership, in the sense that the organization, if you want to change the organization, if you want to change the culture of the organization, it really has to start from the top. It has to have buy-in, of course, but that comes when the top shows that there is actually value in doing this, right? So the value comes from transparency, from the fact that everybody starts finally understanding how decisions are being made, and the fact that their stuff is not being ignored. It's just that other stuff may be more important today, right? So it's really kind of to a large extent, a top-down exercise, but of course not in the sense of sending a memo and saying from tomorrow this is the way we're doing things. It really has to be an exercise in which everybody can start seeing the value. Now, that is often coming by trying. So what we very often do is what we call proofs of concept, where we'll go into an organization, we'll take a department, and we'll actually, for a couple of months, work with them maybe to actually see how could better decision making affect both the bottom line, but also the culture of the organization, because now you're effectively feeling part of the equation and part of the process more so than you did before, maybe.
Okay, Matt, if I would throw that back over to you, and if I would ask, how is digital? So we talked about organizational alignment, leadership, top down. We know that unless we have leaders in alignment with what the rest of the organization is doing, that we're not going to be having the successful outcomes that we're looking for. But Matt, let me come over to you and say, how would that aspect of digital translate to acceleration? If we go back to that question someone asked.
Yeah, so I guess I'll take a bit of a different spin in talking about how to kind of accelerate some of these transformation initiatives. And I think at the end of the day, like, transformation for transformation's sake doesn't really get much traction, right? And so just like we've been speaking about today, in terms of value, is that every project, every transformation initiative needs to have that value. And so being able to define the benefits or what you're hoping to achieve and actually be able to communicate that across the organization means you're much more likely to get buy-in and kind of accelerate the initiative you may be looking to complete.
Good, excellent. And I see with all the different tools that we have available to us today, with digital and with advanced analytics, it becomes more and more possible to achieve some of these things. I want to talk about that in just a minute. But before I go away from this subject, I wanted to come back and say, Baudouin, is if we're looking at organizational alignment and leadership, how do you feel that organizational and alignment in the outcomes of your company affect the people down below? So if I were to ask you, is that, do you think that you guys in Copperleaf have a focused, company, a focused message, and you think people are heading in the right direction, together collectively, and how does that ultimately affect your ability to produce results?
So when you're talking about the people down below, you mean lower in the organization? In
the people within the organization. I shouldn't be using the word down below. I meant, contained within the organization, working together as a team to achieve successful outcomes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I say, I think in many organizations, what you wind up with is a relatively obscure decision-making process. Very often, if you go and ask the shop floor guys, how was this decision made? The answer is, I have no clue. It just came down. And I think what we're trying to do to a large extent is make that whole process more understandable to the point where everybody buys into the decisions that are being made because they are the right decisions and everybody has seen it happen in front of their eyes, literally, through the whole process of decision making. So that is a key component, and that's also why we get a lot of traction, is because very often you get to this moment of revelation where finally we all understand how we came to this discussion, to this decision, right, or to this portfolio of decisions on a yearly basis or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of that going on. We talked about digitalization. That also means that, of course, more and more we're using data, and data doesn't lie, at least in theory. So we're using data to make decisions as opposed to our emotions and other factors that we talked about earlier. So it is becoming a more rational process, which certainly helps in many organizations in building confidence. But it's not only within the organization, it's also outside. Like we talked earlier about ESG factors and the fact that, therefore, effectively the world is looking over your shoulder and going like, well, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing about it? And having a good decision-making process that you can justify internally makes it also easier to justify it externally. So basically, you can really show that you're doing the right thing to your other stakeholders, which might be your customers. It might be, other influencing groups that somehow have a say in whatever is supposed to happen within your organization.
Yeah, very good. I see how leadership and alignment, are so critical in the outcomes and important. Hey, let's move to a little bit. I've had some questions that are coming in. I'm not going to put them up just yet, but they do feed right into sort of the next group of topic we want to have. And people are already saying, well, all right, we know we need to do this. We know that we need a framework and a methodology, but how do we go about doing that? And hey, before I do that, let me just recognize a few other people that have checked in. We have visitors from India up above, Jagdish. We have visitors from Turkey down there. We have Ali Osman coming to us from Turkey. Thanks for joining us, from all around the world. Isn't it amazing how digital can, how digital can allow us to connect with people all around the world? It just wasn't that long ago that this just wasn't even possible. I think it's fun to know that, people are listening to your message, in all parts of the world at the same time. So thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. Listen, on this subject of how, I have a question. I have a couple of slides that I threw up there, and just to kind of make a point, is that a lot of times we might have, 1, 2, 3, or 4 projects that we're considering. We might have 6, 8, 10, 12, 1,000, 100, or more. And in the end, that becomes a very, very complicated decision-making framework, and it gets beyond the ability, of our capacity to do this without, some kind of methodology or framework that we talked about. So let's jump into the how. And maybe I want to start out, or maybe kick that off by just asking, is that, Bodwin, is that you talked a little bit about maybe a pilot project or an assessment, or, where would somebody even start if they wanted to begin looking at how do we optimize our ability to make planning decisions better?
Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about value, and you could argue that really is primarily to evaluate the value that every individual project brings to the organization. Now, you rightly point out that most organizations are dealing with dozens or hundreds of projects. Certainly, if you look at a full budget cycle, and the question becomes, how do I rank that, or how do I pick what to do when? And that's, of course, where value actually really becomes interesting, because if I have valued all the projects on a common scale, effectively what I'm saying is they're all comparable now. Wherever they come from, whatever their nature is, they're all comparable because they're all valued on a common scale, which means that I can actually feed them all into now a mathematical optimization engine, which will effectively tell you exactly what to do when. And now you could argue with the result, of course, and sure, management is perfectly welcome to do that, but at least what the mathematical maximum is that you could achieve value-wise, right? Because math doesn't lie. It'll tell you exactly what the perfect answer is. If you as an organization choose to deviate for whatever reason that might be, that's fine, but at least you know what your theoretical maximum is, which also means that if you don't go for that exercise or for that particular solution, you know exactly what you're leaving on the table. So that is actually very powerful, and that's really what gets a lot of people excited is the fact that now I actually know what I should be going for, and now we can start negotiating, or we can start looking at external factors which might force us to do slightly different. But at least I know what I'm up for. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, which we touched on earlier on in passing, was the fact that many organizations are, of course, they're not greenfield organizations. They start, they've been in operation for 50, 100 years. So they have billions worth of physical assets in operation. And these assets need attention. So risk comes back to the picture, right? If I don't look after my assets, they're going to blow up. They're going to stop working. They're going to do bad things to me. So in other words, there's risk, and I need to mitigate that risk. And that's another part where kind of the systematic approach of collecting data, using that data to determine how those assets will evolve over time, and consequently at which point ideally should I intervene on those assets. That's something which again can be helped by doing this kind of systematic analysis that we're talking about here. So there is two aspects. There's the bottom up, which I just mentioned. It's like, leveraging the asset data to determine what to do when. And then there is a top down, which is applying the constraints. It's like, well, you have so much money, so many people, and, thousands of projects that we would like to do. We're going to have to kind of somehow come up with an optimal for that. And that's where we use optimization. So if you blend those two together, you come up with something very, very powerful as far as, a framework to really kind of make more rational capital decisions.
Yeah, and I know that is a very complex process. And let me throw this question out there. There's a question from Daniel Smock there. And Matt, maybe you could help us to answer this, is that, given that really complicated process that has been laid out, Godwin, is that how long does that process typically take to complete with a company? And there was a little bit of discussion about a proof of concept. I think that's how you framed it. Is that how long does this even take, Matthew? I mean, how?
Yeah, it's interesting. You said the word complete, and I think that's a bit misleading. Like the journey to making better decisions and developing that framework and methodology can be endless, right? As the business continues to evolve, you have new things that become important to you and should be considered in your definition of value. Now, like the scope and timing it would take to do initial assessment can definitely vary quite a bit depending on where people are today and where their expected outcomes are. I've gone through this process with a number of companies, and it's ranged from 2 months exercise if we have everyone bought into the methodology at the start, and sometimes it can be up to 4 to 6 months.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting the way you put that. And Bodwin, you said this earlier, is that everybody's essentially marching down the path, and nobody's starting from nothing. All right, they all have a portfolio of assets. They have a capital. They have an IT portfolio that exists. And so to ask the question that says, how long does it take? Matt, you answered it as it's an ongoing process. And so it's more of, I look at it as an on-ramp onto the freeway, is that we're going to come onto the freeway at a certain particular point and be heading on a journey. And along the way, there's certain things we're going to do to be able to achieve success. And we're not really arriving at a destination. We're really optimizing the entire process as we go forward. Really.
And you can link that, behind all this at the theory level, if you wish. There is a standard that was developed by ISO, the International Standards Organization. So there's a standard called ISO 55001, which is effectively the management system for asset management. And it actually spells out a lot of what we discussed today. And as you well know, ISO is based on a model for continuous improvement. So in other words, you're never perfect, right? Like there's always ways you can improve your processes. And I think that's pretty much the way we look at it too.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, Bodwin, you brought up.
I was going to say,
go ahead, Matt. Yeah,
I do think it's important, for companies looking to go on this journey. It's not about boiling the ocean, right? You're not trying to get the entire way in the first step or kind of as close as you can. What you're trying to do is identify the areas in which we're going to make the biggest improvements today. So that's probably focusing on the most highest important decisions, and then using that as a starting point and leveraging that experience to kind of expand from there.
Okay, great. Bodwin, you brought up standards. I understand that you also participate in some standards bodies. How do standards bodies out there affect or influence the things that we do when we're trying to make these kind of capital planning decisions?
Well, I mean, standards are nearly should reflect reality, right? Like in a way, if you look at a standard, especially an international standard like ISO would publish, effectively, it should be a collection of best practices from around the world. So in other words, it's sharing as opposed to inventing in a way, right? And that's pretty much what we see. We see that there is a couple of markets and countries around the world where asset management, in this case, is more advanced, just for historic reasons. Pressure that came from sometimes regulators, sometimes from the public or whatever, and they came up with clever ideas, basically. And a collection of those clever ideas translates into a standard. And that's really what 55,000 is, in the same way that you'd find other management systems, the best known, of course, being 9001 for quality. So this one, 55,001 is exactly the same, except that it applies to how you manage your assets within your organization, which is really what we're trying to do here. So it's effectively a collection of best practices. And we talked about value, that's in there. Risk-informed decision-making is in there. Bringing your stakeholders in, optimization. All those factors all those elements are very clearly described in that standard as things you should consider.
And I understand that you sit on. So I understand you sit on the Institute for Asset Management board. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And are you seeing? How do you see this problem? Maybe across the industry. If we look across industry, are you seeing it being handled, or what are the challenges that exist across the industry from that board perspective?
Oh, so, well, actually, the beauty of the Institute of Asset Management, of course, is that it is cross-industry. It's essentially the think tank for asset management across industries, which means that you do get to talk to, very diverse groups, both from around the world and from different markets or different segments or different industries, if you wish. And you can clearly see that some industries are just ahead, and I think they're mostly ahead because of external pressure, which has forced them to think this over a bit earlier, maybe. Utilities come to mind because utilities tend to be heavily economically regulated. So in other words, somebody's been breathing down their neck saying, like, what are you doing about this? So that, of course, kind of forces you to think about it maybe a bit earlier than others who effectively only have themselves to report to. So that works. I mean, utilities are number one, therefore, in that regard, if you wish, but you can see a lot of other industries jumping on board. We've talked very, for the last 2-3 years, like a lot of interest in oil and gas, a lot of interest in the transformative industries, chemicals for sure, transportation. So you can see that all the other asset-intensive organizations or sectors, if you wish, are starting to kind of catch up and are seeing the benefits of what's going on with the early adopters.
So, gentlemen, I want to throw one more question up, and then I want to jump to a case study. We have a question here. It's kind of a long 2-part question. I'm gonna let you guys answer it. Maybe each answer half of it. But if we could just throw that question up there, there you go. It's kind of long. But when we're talking about how, one of the first questions that gets asked is, what's the typical qualifications and roles that drive digital transformation in an organization? So let me maybe start with you, Matt, and say, what are the people and what are their qualifications that you've typically worked with in the past who get involved in digital transformation within an organization?
Yeah, for sure. So there's usually many, many stakeholders throughout the business that are required to be engaged. You've almost certainly got someone from the IT side to handle the digital component of it, trying to incorporate new systems into existing systems and leveraging the data that's available. But we also work with, real business leads and experts who really understand the projects they're trying to deliver, whether that be from the growth, sustainability, or even asset sustainment side of the business. And, they're kind of the messengers or the voice of the business to say, here's how we would do things. And so it's a real kind of team effort involved between the IT component and the business leads to drive that transformation.
Okay, excellent. If I look at the second half of that question, Bodwin, let me ask you this, is that when a company decides that transformation is in order, and the question says, is that who do they usually task with driving it? So who's the leadership in driving a digital transformation effort within a company? How would you answer that question?
Well, my experience tells me there is no right answer. I've seen it all. We've seen in some organizations, I say frustration bubble from middle management, in the sense, middle management has been trying different routes. maybe have been forced to try different routes, didn't work out, and at some point they go like, okay, enough. We need to rethink this whole thing, and they will start small in the sense they might start with one department or division of the organization, start kind of experimenting, and when it works out, then they start selling it to the rest of the organization. So that's one way. The other way, and actually you mentioned case studies, like one of the interesting case studies that we had in the last year is the exact opposite. It's an organization in Europe where a chief transformation officer was appointed, and as you can imagine, the role of that chief transformation officer was to get everybody lined up and get serious about this, and that of course kind of injects a level of energy across the whole organization, which would be hard to achieve by little pockets of disruption that that would be the other route, right? So you can see both happening. Of course, if speed is of the essence, then presumably the CTO approach is better because you get everybody's attention right away. The first approach would be more experimental and might take a few years before it gains traction within an organization.
So one of the things you said that was kind of interesting is that when you said a chief transformation officer, we're not necessarily talking about digital transformation. We're talking about transformation of a business is what we're talking about, right?
Well, they go hand in hand very often, right? Like, the reason why you need a digital transformation is because your business is transforming altogether. And the digitization is part of the answer.
Yeah, and the way I usually tell people in these kind of conversations is that technology is really an enabler, and we have to go back and forth between people, processes, and technology. And you have to go through that cycle, and they enable each other is what they do. Hey, listen, I want to talk about a case study. Maybe you brought up the idea of a case study, but one of the things I wanted to point out before we do that is somebody asked a question here, which is interesting. They said, okay, you're a Canadian company. Are regulations different in Canada, or are you really speaking to people worldwide? And so if we could maybe talk about a case study, and are some of your customers worldwide, or are they just Canadian customers? Could we start, Brodwin, with you on that?
Well, I mean, as any good startup, we started close to home. So we definitely started in Canada, but that was many, many years ago. By now, we are definitely worldwide. We pretty much operate on every continent, with the exception of Africa. I don't think we have a single customer yet, but everywhere else we have both customers and our own operations. So it's going well from that point of view, and it makes sense too, because the problem is a global problem. It has nothing to do with a specific country or a specific industry. You could argue that it applies worldwide. So from that point of view, yes. Now the question as to how does Canada compare to the US? I'd say that it's not so much regulation; it's more inspiration. And if you look at Canada, they tend to look more at Europe than the US does, maybe for just historic reasons. Consequently, they tend to get more inspired by what's happening, in particular in the UK, which in this particular case tends to be one of the leading countries in the world. So the UK and Australia, you could argue, are the two most advanced in these kind of techniques. Consequently, Canada is carefully copying what's going in both those countries. The US tends to be a bit more insular in the sense that they're so big that they don't look as much as what others are doing.
So do you have an example of a case study maybe that you could talk to us about that would help us understand, how these techniques are being able to be used to create value?
Yeah, and actually, I've been thinking about this because you asked me the question the other day, and of course we have many, many case studies, many different scenarios, but one that I always enjoyed, and actually it kind of ties in with the background behind you there, the backdrop of a more chemical and industrial background. So one of the very big oil and gas organizations in South America started this journey very early on, actually years ago. And it was indeed a middle management sheer frustration exercise. So they had come to the conclusion that the way they were making decisions made absolutely no sense. And this was middle management who came to that conclusion. And they just felt that it was a massive waste of resources for the organization, A. And B, in their case, they were also battling with very high inflation, which made decision-making very difficult because, of course, depending on how inflation might look and exchange rates, you wind up with very different scenarios as to what you should do or not do. So they really kind of convinced their own organization, and it took them a while. It took them 2-3 years, I think, just internally to sell it to top management. The fact that they needed to have a better process to make decisions, and this was across a very, very large organization, and it's a good example of the level of frustration that I think exists in many organizations, except that they don't know where to go or how to go about it, right? And I think that's something which we're starting to see change now, is by sharing notes across countries, across industries, and through standards. People are starting to come to the realization that there is better ways of doing things, so let's go for it. So that's something that we've seen. I mentioned earlier the opposite approach that was actually in Europe, the Chief Transformation Officer approach, and that was really because of the urgency of it all. Those were people who were very strongly affected by the energy transformation exercise right now. So basically the fact that, we have to decarbonize, in this case, utilities, and therefore they really had a very urgent agenda. They needed to rethink their company, basically. And that kind of forced them, as you rightly pointed out, to appoint a CTO to transform the whole business. But a big part of that was digitalization and decision-making processes.
Okay. Hey, Matt, I want to throw a side question off to you. This is a local power plant that was up on the screen there. And I understand from some of our previous discussions that energy and power generation maybe are a little bit more mature than some others. Is that a fact? And do we learn anything from that?
Yeah, certainly. And I think Baldwin spoke to this. Certainly, we noticed that the utility companies tend to be the most advanced when it comes to having a framework or for evaluating their projects. And as Baldwin said, that's likely because they're basically being forced to defend their decision making to regulators, because that's how they secure their funding, right? And the purpose of a utility, if it's government owned, is really to serve their clients or people within the communities best. And so they really had to start to expand that definition of value first. And I think it's important, like the methodology, like ISO 55000 and what we've been talking about today is industry agnostic, right? And so having gone through that journey with many companies on the most mature side, we can take those learnings, kind of wrap them up, simplify them where needed, but apply them to almost any business and any industry there is.
Yeah, it's one of the things I really try to encourage people to do is to be looking at industries, adjacent industries. And since this power generation industry, somebody asked a couple of times in the questions, where was that power plant? That's actually in Jacksonville. That was taken from a drone photo actually, of a Jacksonville electric generation plant. But the question is that we need to learn from adjacent industries, and the power generation industry has been forced, as you said earlier in the broadcast here, Baldwin, to spend time and energy to be able to justify their rates and what they're doing and their capital expenditures. And so they were early on working on maturing their processes in evaluating how to get the most value from capital spend. And so, what other industries need to be doing is looking at how that digital can be applied within our own industries, and how we can create and model successes after those which have learned and to those who have gone, ahead of us. We don't always need to be the ones that are creating it. We can learn from the successes of others and implement those things in other industries.
Can I make two little comments here? Because
Please.
I think you're very right, and it points to two different aspects of this game too. First of all, I mentioned the energy transition, which of course is forcing the power sector in particular to really switch gears quickly. So that, of course, in its own right, is often the reason why you have to rethink your decision making. And the reason for that is I have my existing asset base, which has been business as usual for maybe 50, 100 years. And now all of a sudden I have this massive disruption coming. So the decision that I have to make every day is, what do I do? Do I actually keep putting money into my old assets, to keep the lights on, literally in this particular case? Or do I, divert all this money and start kind of investing in alternate technologies, etc.? So this tension is horrible, of course, right, from a decision-making point of view. So that actually forces you to really kind of line up your ducks and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? And what is, how do we do this? Literally. So that's one. And it ties into a second aspect, which is uncertainty. And that is not only energy transition, that's in general, of course, the uncertainty in the world around us, which effectively means that you have to try different scenarios. What if, inflation keeps increasing? What if the pandemic stretches for another 5 years? What if, government changes and with it, regulations change? So these questions happen all the time. Historically, it's been very, very difficult for companies to actually play that game, in the sense that recalculating a complete annual budget, in different scenarios is horrible. It's just very painful. Customers often tell us it took them months to do that. Digitalization accelerates that to the point where you can actually play what if scenarios at your heart's content, right? Like you can literally run 100 scenarios, because it's just, literally pressing a button. So that gives you a level of confidence in your decision making, which is way higher, because you've actually tested all these scenarios and you know that the route that you're taking is actually the best route, based on what you know, of course.
Yeah. And I think that earlier on in the broadcast, we talked about how we have outside factors in the industry that are affecting us. And one of the things that I have seen after interviewing hundreds of people in the last couple of years, just like this here today, is that the most successful companies have been able to be resilient and be able to respond quickly. And one of the things you're talking about right now is resilience and the ability to optimize and to do things differently. And if we're just operating business as usual, we're not going to find ourselves in a situation where we can be successful when factors around us change. Factors around us change. I mean, Baudouin, you said you're a sailor. If the winds change, you don't keep trying to sail in the same direction, do you? No, you change your boat, you leverage the new winds, and you have to change your tack to be able to match, the success of where you need to go. And it was because you evaluated the factors around you, you made good decisions to be able to drive in the direction where you were trying to go. So I think that it's really important for us, to be resilient and being dynamic. And so I think that having digital transformation brings us to a place where we can do that. Gentlemen, a couple of things here I wanted to ask you is that, Baudouin, if I were to ask you is that, at this time in history, what's one of the most exciting things for you with respect to this topic? I mean, what's exciting to you?
Well, there's two layers, of course. First, there's just like, as an engineer, the fact that you see rational decision making kind of coming to the top. This is back to my car frustration from 30, 40 years ago. Obviously that is just cool. But I think the other aspect, which is maybe more interesting, is the fact that this whole ESG movement, which effectively means that we're starting to look after the planet, after its inhabitants, and we're essentially coming up with a much broader vision of what we're trying to achieve here as a society, right? The fact that has become very important now, and that it's actually starting to percolate down to individual decisions that we make every day in our organizations, that is phenomenal too, because I think that kind of shifts us from the old shareholder capitalism to what is now called stakeholder capitalism. That is an unbelievable shift, and I think that's with us to stay, and for the better.
Yeah, that is exciting. I think we've all been looking for that, as all industries, mature, but that is really exciting. I really agree with that we have more consciousness toward those things. This is our second live broadcast in a series of 3. We have another one coming up. But Matt, if people want to, reach out to you and continue a conversation like this, what's the best way to reach you or to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can reach out to me either here on LinkedIn, or you can email me directly at mhayart@copperleaf.com.
Okay, perfect. There's the email address on the screen there. So if people want to reach out, feel free to reach out. Let me also say that we have our third broadcast in a series next week at the same time, 9 o'clock Pacific, 12 Eastern. And next week, we're going to actually have an industry expert who's been faced with these challenges in the industry. And we're going to be talking about practical, hands-on elements of that. And so join us next week as we talk about this subject again, digital transformation, but now from a industry perspective, a person who's been in the industry. Hey, I also wanted to mention that we've had so much interest in this subject that we've decided we're going to do a webinar in the future as well. And the difference between a live broadcast and a webinar is we're actually going to dig in a little bit deeper and do a traditional webinar where there'll be some presentation and taking a look at some of the different elements of case studies and elements of what people are actually doing, some real hands-on stuff. And if you want to sign up for that webinar, it's actually on February 16th. You can see that scrolling across the screen on the bottom there. You can go to registerme.name and actually sign up for this upcoming webinar. It's Value Undiscovered. It's making CapEx decisions that reduce risk and increase ROI. But I think you taught me something earlier here, Bud, when the name shouldn't be ROI. It should be maybe increasing value, because it's more than just, return on investment. So
I think so.
Yeah.
Unless your investment definition is very broad.
There you go. It should be a very broad discussion of that. Perfect. All right. Well, listen, so gentlemen, I really appreciate you taking time, to have this conversation with us today. I really find it insightful, and I see we've had an awful lot of people that have joined us today and have seen it. So thank you, and I appreciate your knowledge and contributions to the industry, and Bodwin, for your passion for what you do and the leadership that you provide to the Copperleaf Company, and Matt, your technical expertise. It's really nice to see how you're applying that and helping people to be successful, through the use of digital and advanced analytics and application of that. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining today. I really appreciate everything that you are doing for the industry.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
excellent. Hey, everybody, join us next week as we come back and look at Value Undiscovered again from an industry perspective. I want to invite you to join us at 9 o'clock Pacific, 12 noon Eastern next Wednesday, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you. From a sailor's perspective myself, I'll just wish all of you fair winds and following seas, and have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you online again.